Clinging to the peddler's thick arm, she swayed enticingly as he took her to see the blood-splashed room. Moraine and the others had gone off to where the Gaishain were erecting the Wise One's camp. When the pair came back out, the young woman shuddered delicately. Rand was sure it was pretense, just as he was sure she had asked to view that butcher's workroom. Her show of revulsion lasted all of 2 seconds, and then she was peering about interestedly at the Aiel. It appeared that Rand himself was one of the sights she wanted to see. Kadir seemed ready to take her back to the wagon, but she guided him to Rand instead, the alluring smile on her full lips playing behind her diaphanous veil. "Adnan has been telling me of you," she said in a smoky voice. She might have been hanging on the peddler, but her dark eyes traced Rand boldly. "You are the one the Aiel talk of. He who comes with the dawn." Kylie and the Gleeman came out of the second wagon and stood together at a distance, watching. "It seems I am," he said. "Strange." Her smile became wickedly mischievous. "I thought you would be handsomer." Patting Kadir on the cheek, she sighed. "This dreadful heat is so wearing. Do not be too long." Kadir did not speak until she had climbed the steps back inside. His hat had been replaced by a long white scarf tied atop his head, the ends handing down his neck. "You must forgive Essendra, good sir. She is too forward sometimes." His voice was mollifying, but his eyes belonged on a bird of prey. He hesitated, then went on. "I have heard other things. I have heard that you took Kalendor out of the heart of the stone." The man's eyes never changed. If he knew about Kalendor, he knew Rand was the Dragon Reborn, knew he could wield the One Power, and his eyes never changed. Dangerous man. "I have heard it said," Rand told him, "that you should believe nothing you hear, and only half of what you see." "A wise rule," Kadir said after a moment. "Yet to achieve greatly, a man must believe something. Belief and knowledge pave the road to greatness. Knowledge is perhaps the most valuable of all. We all seek the coin of knowledge. Your pardon, good sir. Essendra is not a patient woman. Perhaps we'll have another opportunity to talk." Before the man had taken 3 steps, Avienda said in a low, hard voice, "You belong to Elaine, Randolph Thor. Do you stare so at every woman who comes in front of your eyes, or only those who go half naked? If I strip off my clothes, will you stare so at me? You belong to Elaine." He had forgotten she was there. "I don't belong to anyone, Avienda. Elaine? She cannot seem to make up her mind what she thinks. Elaine laid her heart bare to you, Randolph Thor. If she did not show you in the Stone of Tyr, did her 2 letters not tell you what she feels? You are hers and no others." Rand threw up his hands and stalked away from her. At least he tried. She followed on his heels, a disapproving shadow in the sun's glare. Swords. The Aiel might have forgotten why they did not carry swords, but they had kept the contempt for them. Swords might make her leave him alone. Seeking out Lan in the Wise One's camp, he asked the warder to watch him work the forms. Bear was the only one of the 4 in view, and a scowl surely deepened the creases on her face. Egwene was not to be seen either. Moraine wore calm like a mask, dark eyes cool. He could not say whether she approved. He was not apt to offend the Aiel, so he set up with Lan between the Wise One's tents and the Jindo's. He used one of the practice swords Lan carried in his baggage, a bundle of loosely tied laths, in place of a blade. The weight and balance were right, though, and he could forget himself in the dance-like flow from form to form, the practice sword alive in his hands, a part of him. Usually it was that way. Today the sun was a furnace in the sky, baking out moisture and strength. Avienda squatted off to one side, hugging her knees to her chest and staring at him. Finally, panting, he let his arms drop. You lost concentration, Lan told him. You must hold on to that, even when your muscles turn to water. Lose it, and that is the day you die. And it will probably be a farm boy who has his hands on a sword for the first time who does it. His smile was sudden, odd on that stony face. Yes, well, I'm not a farm boy any longer, am I? They had gained an audience, if at a distance. Aiel lined the edge of both the Shido and Jindo camps. Kylie's cream-whipped bulk stood out among the Jindo, the gleeman beside her in his cloak of colored patches. Which one did he choose? He did not want them to see him watching them. How do Aiel fight, Lan? Hard, the warder said dryly. They never lose concentration. Look here. With his sword, he drew on the hard, cracked clay a circle and arrows. Aiel changed tactics according to circumstances, but here is one they favor. They move in a column, divided into quarters. When they meet an enemy, the first quarter rushes in to pin them. The second and third move wide to either side, hitting the flank and rear. The last quarter waits in reserve, often not even watching the battle, except for their leader. When a weakness opens, a hole, anything, the reserve strikes there. Finish. His sword stabbed into a circle, already pierced with arrows. How do you beat them? With difficulty. When you first make contact, you'll not spot Aiel before they strike unless you are lucky. You send out your horsemen to break up, or at least delay the attacks. If you keep most of your strength back and defeat the holding attack, then you can wheel on the others in turn and defeat them too. Why do you want to learn how to fight Aiel? Avienda burst out. Are you not he who comes with the dawn, meant to bind us together and return us all to old glories? Besides, if you want to know how to fight Aiel, ask Aiel, not a wetlander. His way will not work. It has worked well enough with bordermen from time to time. Ruark's soft boots made very little sound on the hard ground. He had a water skin under his arm. Allowances are always made when someone suffers a disappointment. But there is a limit to joking. You gave up the spear for your obligation to the people and the blood. One day, no doubt, you will be making a clan chief do what you want instead of what he wants. But if instead you are wise one to the smallest of the smallest sept of the Tardad, the obligation remains, and it cannot be met by tantrums.
Hey, OG, how you doing?
Rand felt a fool. Of course that was why she had gone to Royan. But he would never have thought Avienda would choose to give up the spear. It certainly explained why she had been chosen to spy on him, though. Suddenly he found himself wondering if she could channel. It seemed Min had been the only woman in his life since that winter night who could not. Ruark tossed him the swashing water skin. The lukewarm water slid down his throat like chilled wine. He tried not to splash any over his face, not to waste it, but it was hard. I thought you might like to learn the spear, Ruark said when Rand finally lowered the half-empty skin. For the first time, Rand realized the clan chief was carrying only 2 spears and a pair of bucklers. Not practice spears, if there were any such. A foot of sharp steel tipped each. Steel or wood, his muscles cried out for rest. His legs wanted him to sit down, and his head wanted to lie down. Kylie and the Gleeman were gone, but Aiel was still watching from both camps.
Hell yeah.
They had seen him practicing with a despised sword, if a wooden one. They were his people. He did not know them, but they were his in more senses than one. Avienda was still watching him too, glowering as though blaming him for Ruark having set her down. Not that she had anything to do with his decision, of course. The Jindo and Shido were watching. That was it. That mountain can grow awfully heavy sometimes, he sighed, taking his spear and buckler from Rourke. When do you find a chance to put it down a while? I landed. Forcing his legs to move and trying to ignore Avienda, Rand squared off with Rourke. He did not mean to die just yet. No, not for a long time yet. Leaning against a tall wheel in the shade of one of the peddler's wagons, Matt glanced at the line of Jindo watching Rand. All he could see now was their backs. The man was a pure fool, leaping about in this heat. Any sensible man would find a bit of protection from the sun, something to drink. Shifting his seat in the shade, he peered into the mug of ale he had bought from one of the drivers and grimaced. Ale just did not taste right when it was as warm as soup. At least it was wet. The only other thing he had bought, aside from the hat, was a short-stemmed pipe with a silver-worked bowl, snuggled now in his coat pocket with his tobacco pouch.
Oh, shit.
Trading was not on his mind. Unless it was for passage out of the waste, a commodity the peddler's wagons did not seem to be offering at the moment. They were doing a steady business, if not for ale. The Aiel did not mind the temperature, but they seemed to think it too weak. Most were Jindo, but there was a steady stream of Shido from the other camp. Couladin and Kadir had their heads together for a long time, though they came to no agreement since Couladin left empty-handed. Kadir must not have liked losing the trade. He stared after Couladin with those hawk's eyes, and a Jindo who wanted his attention had to speak 3 times before he was heard. The Aiel did not show much in the way of coin, but the peddlers and their people were quick to accept silver bowls or gold figurines or fine wall hangings looted from Tyr, and Aiel pouches produced raw nuggets of gold and silver that made Matt sit up. But an Aiel who lost at dice might well reach for his spears. He wondered where the mines were. Where one man could find gold, another could. It was probably a lot of work, though, mining gold. Taking a long drink of warm ale, he settled back against the wagon wheel. What sold and what did not, and at what price, was interesting. The Aiel were no simple fools to hand over a gold salt cellar, say, for a bolt of cloth. They knew the value of things and bargained hard, though they had their own wants. Books went immediately. Not everyone wanted them, but those who did took every last one the wagons held. Laces and velvets vanished as soon as they were brought out, for astonishing quantities of silver and
that's
gold,
not bad.
and ribbons for not much less. But the finest silks just lay there. Silk was cheaper in trade to the east, he overheard a Shido tell Kadir. A heavy-set, broken-nosed driver tried to talk a Jindo maiden into a carved ivory bracelet. She pulled one wider, thicker, and more ornate from her pouch and offered to wrestle him for the pair. He hesitated before refusing.
That's even better because you'd probably be able to get them at a slight discount since they're older ones.
Snapped up, but the pots and most of the knives earned sneers. Aiel smiths did better work. Everything changed hands, from vials of perfumes and bath salts to kegs of brandy. Wine and brandy fetched good prices. He was startled to hear Hiren ask for 2 rivers tobacco. The peddlers had none. One driver kept trying to interest the Aiel in a heavy gold-worked crossbow with no success. The crossbow caught Matt's eye, all those inlaid gold lions with what seemed to be rubies for eyes. Small, but still rubies. Of course, a good 2 Rivers longbow could shoot 6 arrows, while Goodman was still cranking back the bowstring for his second shot. A longer range for a crossbow that size, though, by 100 paces.
Nice.
With 2 men doing nothing but keeping a crossbow with bolt in place in the hands of each crossbowman, and stout pikemen to hold the cavalry off. Wincing, Matt let his head fall back against the spokes. It had happened again. He had to get out of the waste, away from Moraine, away from any Aes Sedai. Maybe back home for a while. Maybe he could get there in time to help with this White Cloak trouble. Small chance of that. One ways. That would not solve his problems anyway. For one thing, there were answers in Emmonsfield to what those snaky folks meant about marrying the daughter of the 9 moons, dying and living again. Or Rudian. Through his coat, he rubbed the silver fox-head medallion, hung around his neck again. The pupil of the fox's eye was a tiny circle split by a sinuous line. One side polished, the other shaded in some way. The ancient symbol of Aes Sedai before the breaking. The black-hafted spear, sword blade point marked with 2 ravens, he took from where it was leaning beside him and laid it across his knees. More Aes Sedai work.
Oh, shit.
Rudian had provided no answers,
They make a good
only more
stew.
questions, and before Rudian, his memory had been full of holes. Casting back in his mind then, he would be able to remember walking up to a door in the morning and leaving in the evening, but not in between. Now there was something in between, filling all those holes. Waking dreams, or something very like. It was as if he could remember dances and battles and streets and cities, none of which he had ever really seen, none of which he was sure had ever existed. Like 100 pieces of memory from 100 different men. Better to think of them as dreams, maybe. A little better. Yet he was as sure in them as in any of his own remembrances. Battles numbered the most, and sometimes they crept up on him in a way, as with the crossbow. He would find himself looking at a piece of ground and planning how to set an ambush there, or defend against one.
Hope you're doing well.
Or how to set an army for battle. It was mapped. Without looking, he traced the flowing strip carved into the black spear haft. He could read it as easily as any book now, though it had taken him the whole trip back to Cheander to realize it. Rand had not said anything, but he suspected he had given himself away there in Rudian. He knew the old tongue now, sifted whole out of those dreams. Light, what did they do to me? Se s'ouvre niende me saigne, he said aloud. I am lost in my own mind. A scholar for this day and age. Matt looked up to find the gleeman looking at him with dark, deep-set eyes. The fellow was taller than most, somewhere in his middle years, and likely attractive to women, but with an oddly apprehensive way of holding his head cocked, as if trying to look at you sideways. Just something I heard once, Matt said. He had to be more careful. If Moraine decided to pack him off to the White Tower for study, they would never let him out of there again.
Oh, yeah, SK. Definitely appreciate it,
remember
bro.
them. I know a few
Always
phrases.
appreciate it.
That should cover any slips he was stupid enough to make. I am Jason Natal, a gleeman. Natal did not flourish his cloak the way Tom would. He could have been saying he was a carpenter or a wheelwright. Do you mind if I join you? Matt nodded to the ground next to him, and the gleeman folded his legs, tucking his cloak under to sit on. He seemed fascinated by the Jindo and Shido milling around the wagons, most still carrying their spears and bucklers. I murmured. I would have expected. I can still hardly credit it. I've been with them for weeks now, Matt said, and I don't know that I believe them myself. Odd people. If any of the maidens ask you to play Maiden's Kiss, my advice is to refuse, politely. Natal frowned at him questioningly. You lead an intriguing life, it seems. What do you mean? Matt asked cautiously. Surely you do not think it is a secret. Not many men travel in company with Aes Sedai, the woman Moraine Damodred. And then there is Randall Thor, the dragon reborn, he who comes with the dawn. Who can say how many prophecies he is supposed to fulfill? An unusual traveling companion, certainly. The Aiel had talked, of course. Anyone would. Still, it was a little unsettling to have a stranger calmly talk about Rand this way. He suits well enough for now. If he interests you, talk to him. Myself, I'd just as soon not be reminded. Perhaps I will. Later, perhaps. Let us talk of you. I understand you went into Rudian. where none save Aiel have gone in 3,000 years. He reached for the spear on Matt's knees, but let his hand fall and Matt slid away slightly. Very well. Tell me what you saw. Why? I am a gleeman, Matrim. Natail had his head cocked to one side in that uneasy manner, but his voice held irritation at having to explain. He lifted a corner of his cloak with its colorful patches as though for proof. You have seen what none have, save a handful of Aiel. What stories can I make with the sights your eyes have seen? I will even make you the hero if you wish. Matt snorted. I don't want to be any bloody hero. Yet there was no reason to keep silent. Amis and that lot could chatter about not speaking of Rudion, but he was no Aiel. Besides, it might pay to have somebody with the peddlers who had a little goodwill toward him, somebody who could put in a word when it was needed. He told the story of reaching the wall of fog to coming out, leaving out selected bits. He had no intention of telling anyone else about that twisted doorway, Tirangrial, and he would rather forget the dust gathering into creatures that tried to kill him. That strange city of huge palaces was surely enough, and Avendasora. The Tree of Life Natail passed over quickly, but he took Matt through the rest again and again, asking more and more details, from exactly what it felt like walking through that fog and how long it took, to the color of the shadowless light inside, to descriptions of every last thing Matt could remember seeing in the great square in the heart of the city. Those Matt gave reluctantly. A slip, and he would find himself talking about Tirangrial, and who knew where that might lead. Even so, he drained the last of the warm ale and still talked until his throat was dry. It sounded rather dull the way he told it, as though he had just walked in and waited while Rand went off, then walked out again. But Natail seemed intent on digging out every last scrap. He did remind Matt of Tom then. Sometimes Tom concentrated on you, as though he meant to wring you dry. Is this what you are meant to be doing? Matt jumped in spite of himself at the sound of Kylie's voice, hard under its mellifluous tones. The woman put him on edge, and now she looked ready to rip his heart out, and the Gleeman's as well. Natail scrambled to his feet. This young man has just been telling me the most fascinating things about Rudion. You will not believe it. We are not here for Rudion. The words came out as sharp as her hatchet of a nose. At least she was only glaring at Natail now. I tell you, you tell me nothing. Do not try to silence me. Ignoring Matt, they moved off down the wagons, arguing in low voices, gesticulating fiercely. Kylie seemed to have been browbeaten into a grim silence by the time they disappeared into her wagon. Matt shivered. He could not imagine sharing living quarters with that woman. It would be like sharing with a bear with a sore tooth. Cassandra now. That face, those lips, that swaying walk. If he could get her away from Kadir, maybe she would find a young hero. The dust creatures could be 10 feet tall for her. He would give her every detail he could remember or invent. A handsome young hero more to her liking than a stuffy old peddler. It was worth thinking about. The sun slid below the horizon, and small fires of thorny branches made pools of yellow light among the tents. The smells of cooking filled the camp. Goat, roasting with dried peppers. Cold filled the camp too, the cold of night in the waste. It was as if the sun had taken all the heat with it. Matt had never expected he would wish for a stout cloak when he packed to leave the stone. Maybe the peddlers had one. Maybe Natail would dice for his. He ate at Ruark's fire with Hiron and Rand. And Avienda, of course. The peddlers were there, and Natail close by Kylie, and Ascendra all but wrapped around Kadir. It might be harder separating Ascendra from the hook-nosed man than he had hoped. Or easier. Twined around the fellow or not, she had smoky eyes for Rand and no one else. You would have thought she already had clipped, a sheep marked for its owner's flock. Neither Rand nor Kadir seemed to notice. The peddler hardly took his eyes off Rand. Avienda noticed and glared at Rand. At least the fire gave off some warmth. When the roast goat was finished, and some sort of flecked yellow mush that was spicier than it looked, Ruark and Hiern filled short-stemmed pipes, and the clan chief asked Natail for a song. The gleeman blinked. Why, of course. Let me bring a harp. His cloak billowed on the dry, cold breeze as he vanished toward Kylie's wagon. The fellow certainly was different from Tom Marilyn. Tom hardly got out of bed without flute or harp or both. Matt thumbed his silver-worked pipe full of tobacco and was puffing contentedly by the time Natail returned, and struck a pose suitable for a king. That was like Tom. With a strummed chord, the gleeman began. Soft the winds like springtime's fingers, soft the rains like heaven's tears. Soft the years roll by in gladness, never hinting storms to come, never hinting whirlwinds ravage. Rain of steel
Hey, Gear
and
Changer,
battle
how you
thunder,
doing?
war to tear the heart asunder. It was Midian's Ford,
Hell
an
yeah.
old song,
Definitely
of
appreciate
Manetheren,
it.
oddly enough, and war before the Trolloc Wars. Natail did a fair job of it, nothing like Tom's sonorous recitals, of course, but the rolling words drew a crowd of Aiel thick around
For
the
me,
edge of
it's
the
not
fiery
even
fire.
midnight yet.
Villainous Adomon led the Safari down an
It's
unsuspecting
like 5
Manetheren,
till 12.
pillaging and burning, driving all before them, until King Burin gathered Manetheren's strength, and the men of Manetheren met the Safari at Midian's Ford, holding, though heavily outnumbered, through 3 days of unrelenting battle, while the river ran red and vultures blacked the sky. On the 3rd day, numbers dwindling, hope fading, Buren and his men fought their way across the ford in a desperate sortie, driving deep into Adomon's horde, seeking to turn the enemy back by killing Adomon himself. But forces too great to overpower swept in around them, trapping them, driving them ever in on themselves. Surrounding their king and the Red Eagle banner, they fought on, refusing surrender even when
About
their
2
doom
hours
became
ahead of me,
clear.
huh?
The
SK.
tale sang how their courage touched even Adomon's heart, and how at last he allowed the remnant to go free, turning his army back to Safair in honor of them.
Gear Changer's like
Back
16.
across the blood-red water, marching back with heads held high. No surrender, arm or sword. No surrender, heart or soul. Honor be theirs, ever after. Honor all the age shall know. He plucked the final chord, and the Aiel whistled their approval, drumming spears on their high bucklers, some raising ululating cries. It had not been that way, of course. Matt could remember. Light, I don't want to. But it came anyway. He remembered counseling Buren not to accept the offer, being told in return that the smallest chance was better than none. Adomon, glossy black beard hanging below the steel mesh that veiled his face, drew his spearmen back, waited until they were strung out and nearly to the ford before the hidden archers rose, and the cavalry charged in. As returning back to Safair, Matt Henry at the ford was trying to keep his feet waist deep in the river with 3 arrows in him, but there was something later, a fragment. Seeing Adomon, gray-bearded now, go down in a sharp fight in a forest, toppling from his rearing horse, the spear in his back put there by an unarmored, beardless boy. This was worse than the holes had been. You did not like the song? Natail said. It took Matt a moment to realize the man was speaking to Rand, not him. Rand rubbed his hands together, peering into the small fire before answering. I'm not certain how wise it is, depending on an enemy's generosity. What do you think, Kadir? The peddler hesitated, glancing at the woman clinging to his arm. I do not think of such things, he said at last. I think of profits, not battles. Kylie laughed coarsely. At least until she saw Essendra's smile, condescending to a woman who could make 3 of her. Then her dark eyes glittered dangerously behind those rolls of fat. Suddenly, warning cries rose in the dark beyond the tents. Aiel
16
snatched
into the
veils
future,
across their
right?
faces, and a moment later, Trollocs poured in out of the night.
Excuse me.
Snouted faces and horned heads, towering over the humans, howling and swinging scythe-curved swords, stabbing with hooked spears and barbed tridents, hacking with spiked axes. Myrddraal flowed with them like deadly eyeless snakes. A heartbeat it took, but the Aiel fought as if they had had an hour's warning, meeting the charge with their own flickering spears. Matt was vaguely aware of Rand with that fiery sword suddenly in hand, but then he was sucked into the maelstrom himself, wielding his spear as spear and quarterstaff.
Hey, movie fan, how you doing?
Haft whirling. He was glad of those dream memories. The way of this weapon seemed familiar, and he needed every scrap of skill he could find.
Hope you're doing good, movie fan.
It was all chaotic madness. Trollocs rose up in front of him and went down to his spear, or an Aiel spear, or spun away into the confusion of shouts and howls and clanging steel. Myrddraal faced him, black blades meeting his raven-marked steel with flashes of blue light like sheet lightning. Faced him, and were gone in the tumult. Twice a short spear streaking by his head took Trollocs about to run him through the back.
Oh, that always sucks.
He thrust the short sword blade into a Myrddraal's chest and knew he was going to die when it did not fall, but grinned with those bloodless
not too
lips.
Bad.
Eyeless stare shivering fear into his
complain,
bones,
none.
And drew back its black sword. An instant later, the halfman jerked as Aiel arrows pin-cushioned it. Jerked for the moment Matt needed to leap back from the thing as it fell, still trying to stab at him. Stab at anything. A dozen times, the spear's iron-hard black haft barely deflected a Trolloc thrust. It was Aes Sedai work, and he was glad of it. The silver foxhead on his chest seemed to pulse with cold, as if to remind him that it, too, bore the mark of Aes Sedai. Right then, he did not care. If it took Aes Sedai work to keep him alive, he was ready to follow Moraine like a puppy. He could not have said if it went on for minutes or hours, but suddenly there was not a Myrddraal or Trolloc still standing in sight, though cries and howls from the darkness spoke of pursuit.
Hey, D-Man, how you doing?
Littered the ground.
Hope you're doing well.
Spawn, the halfman still crashing.
Not too bad.
Groans filled the air with pain. Suddenly he realized his muscles felt like water, and his lungs were afire. Panting, he slid down to his knees, leaning on his spear.
I should be done with that one that I am doing.
Three of the peddler's canvas top
I'm going to shoot for tomorrow.
One with a driver pinned to the side by a Trolloc spear. And some of the tents were burning.
There's not that much left to go.
Shouts from the direction of the Shido camp, and glows too large for campfires, said they had been attacked too. Fiery sword still in hand, Rand came to where Matt was.
How are you doing, D-Man?
Are you all right? Avienda shadowed him. Somewhere she had found a spear and buckler, had tucked up a corner of her shawl to veil her face. Even in skirts, she looked deadly. Oh, I am fine, Matt muttered, struggling to his feet. Nothing like a little dance with Trollocs to ready you for sleep. Right, Avienda? Uncovering her sleeve, she gave him a tight smile. The woman had probably enjoyed it. He was sweat all over. He thought it might freeze on him. Moraine and Egwene had appeared with two of the wise ones, Amis and Bear, circulating among the wounded. The convulsion of the Aes Sedai, though sometimes she merely shook her head. Roark stood up. Bad news, Grand Chief. The Grand Chief grunted. Aside from Trollocs here, where they should not be, not by 200 leagues or more, perhaps. Some 50 Trollocs attacked the wise ones.
Hell yeah, D-Man.
Enough to overwhelm it, had it not been for Moraine Sedai and luck. However, the Shido were hit by fewer than some. Though since they are the larger camp, the reverse should have been true.
Excuse me.
I might almost think they were attacked only to keep them from coming to our aid. Not the the Shido. Trollocs and Nightrunners might not know.
And that's good, D-Man, that you're doing good.
And if they knew an Aes Sedai was with the wise ones, Grant said, that attack could have been meant to keep her away too. I bring enemies with me, Roark. Remember that. Wherever I am, my enemies are never far. Cassandra poked her head out of the wagon. A moment later, Kadir started moving faster, and she ducked back inside, shutting the white-painted door behind him.
That's a good hit.
He stood looking around at the carnage.
I guess it helps that
burning wagons painting
it's a bowl loaded with some
the
Acapulco gold flour.
Most.
Then I topped it with some
seemed to interest him not at all.
ice cream cake sugar wax.
Speaking up the stairs to her still inside.
So it's definitely a good mix.
His eyes on Matt and the others. Fools, Matt muttered, half to himself, hiding inside the wagons as if that would make any difference to a Trolloc. They could have all roasted alive, easy as not. They are still alive, Rand said, and Matt realized he had seen them too. That is always important, Matt. Who stays alive? It's like dice. You can't win if you can't play, and you can't play if you are dead. Who can say what game the peddlers play? He laughed quietly, and the fiery sword vanished from his hands. I'm going to get some sleep, Matt said, already turning away. Wake me if the Trollocs show up again, or better, let them kill me in my blankets. I'm too tired to wake up again. Rand was definitely on the edge. Maybe tonight would convince Kylie and Kadir to turn back. If they did, he intended to be with them. Rand let Moraine look at him, muttering to herself, though he had taken no wound. With so many who had, she could not spare the strength to wash away his fatigue with the one power. This was aimed at you, she told him, surrounded by the moans of the injured. The Trollocs were being dragged away into the night by pack horses and the peddlers' mules. The Aiel apparently intended to leave the Murdville where they lay until they stopped moving, to make sure they were really dead. The wind gusted up, like ice with no moisture in it. Was it? He said. Her eyes glittered in the firelight before she turned back to the wounded. Egwene came to him too, but only to say in a low, fierce whisper, "Whatever you are doing to upset her, stop it." The glance she shot past him at Avienda left no doubt who she meant, and she went off to help Bear and Amis before he could say he had done nothing. She looked ridiculous with those two braids twined with ribbons. The Aiel seemed to think so too. Some of them grinned at her back. Stumbling, shivering, he sought his tent. He had never been this tired before. The sword had almost not come. He hoped that was the tiredness. Sometimes there was nothing there when he reached for the source, and sometimes the power would not do what he wanted. But almost from the first, the sword had come practically without thought. Now, of all times, it had to be the tiredness. Avienda insisted on following him as far as the tent, and when he woke the next morning, she was sitting outside cross-legged, though without the spear and buckler. Spy or not, he was glad to see her. At least he knew who and what she was, and what she felt for him.
Chapter 38. Hidden Faces. The Garden of Silver Breezes was not a garden at all, but a huge wine shop, much too large to be called a shop, really, atop a hill centered on the Calpena, the westernmost of Tanchico's 3 peninsulas below the Great Circle. A part of the name, at least, came from the breezes that wafted in, where polished green-streaked marble columns and balustrades replaced one wall, except on the topmost floor. Golden oiled silk curtains could be lowered in case of rain. The hill fell away sharply on that side, and the tables along the balustrades gave a clear view across white domes and spires of the great harbor, crowded with more ships than ever. Tanchico needed everything desperately, and there was gold to be made, until the gold and time ran out. With its gilded lamps and ceilings inlaid with brass fretwork polished to a golden gleam, its serving women and men chosen for grace and beauty and discretion, the Garden of the Silver Breezes had been the most expensive wine shop in the city even before the Troubles. Now it was outrageous. But those who dealt in huge sums still came, those who dealt in power and influence, or thought they did. In some ways there was less to deal in than before, in others more. Low walls surrounded each table, making islands dotted across the green and golden floor tiles, each wall pierced with lacy carving so no eavesdropper could listen unseen, stood just high enough to hide who met whom from the casual glances of passers-by. Even so, patrons usually went masked, especially of late, and some had a bodyguard beside their table, also masked to avoid recognition if the patron was prudent. And tongueless, rumor said, for the most prudent. No guard was visibly armed. The proprietress of the Garden of Silver Breezes, a sleek woman of indeterminate age named Cylindrin, allowed no weapons past the street now. Her rule was not open, at least open. From her usual table against the balustrade, Gyanin watched the ships in the harbor, especially those under sail. They made her want to be back on the deck, giving orders. She had never expected duty to bring her to this. Unconsciously, she adjusted the velvet mask that hid the upper half of her face. She felt ridiculous wearing the thing, but it was necessary to blend in to some extent. The mask was to match her high-necked silk gown, the gown itself, and her dark hair, grown down to her shoulders now, were as far as she could make herself go. Passing for a Taraboner was unnecessary. Tanchico bulged with refugees, a good many of them foreigners swept up in the Troubles, and it was beyond her in any case. These people were animals. They had no discipline, no order. Regretfully, she turned from the harbor to her table companion, a narrow-faced fellow with a weasel's greedy smile. Floran Gelb's frayed collar did not belong in the Garden of Silver Breezes, and he continually wiped his hands on his coat. She always met them here, the greasy little men she was forced to deal with. It was a reward for them, and the means of keeping them off balance. "What do you have for me, Master Gelb?" Wiping his hands again, he lifted a coarse jute bag onto the table and watched her anxiously. She held the bag down beside her before opening it. A silvery metal eidam lay inside, a collar and bracelet connected by a leash, cunningly worked and joined. She closed the bag and set it on the floor. This made 3 that Gelb had recovered, more than anyone else. "Very good, Master Gelb." A small purse went across the table the other way. Gelb made it disappear under his coat as if it held the Empress's crown instead of a handful of silver. "And do you have anything else?" "Those women. The ones you wanted to look for?" She had grown used to the quick speech of these people, but she wished he would not lick his lips that way. It did not make him any harder to understand, but it was unsightly. She very nearly told him she was not interested anymore, but this was a part of why she was in Tanchico after all, maybe the whole reason now. What of them? That she could even think of shirking her duty made her speak more harshly than she had intended, and Gelb flinched. I think I've found another one." "You are sure? There have been mistakes." Mistakes was a gentle way to put it. Near a dozen women who came only vaguely near the descriptions had been nuisances she could ignore once she had seen them. But that noblewoman, a refugee from estates burned out by the war. Gelb had kidnapped the woman off the street, thinking to earn more for delivering her than for telling where she was. In his defense, the Lady Lylewyn closely matched one of the women Egyanin sought, but she had told him they would not speak with any accent he recognized, certainly not a Taraboner accent. Egyanin had not wanted to kill the woman, yet even in Tanchico someone might have listened to her story. Lylewyn had gone bound and gagged onto one of the courier boats in the dead of night. She was young and pretty, and someone would find a better use for her than slitting her throat. But Egyanin was not in Tanchico to find serving girls for the blood. "No mistakes, Mistress Elidar," he said hastily, flashing that smile full of teeth. "Not this time. But I need a little gold, to be sure, to get close enough. 4 or 5 crowns? I pay for results, Egyanin told him firmly. After your mistakes, you are lucky that I pay you at all. Gelb licked his lips nervously. You said, back in the beginning, you said you'd have a few coins for those who could do special sorts of work. A muscle in his cheek twitched. His eyes darted as if someone might be listening at the lace-carved wall around 3 sides of the table, and his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. Stirring up trouble, as it were? I heard a rumor from a fellow who's body servant to Lord Brees about the assembly and choosing the new panarch. I think maybe it's true. The man was drunk, and when he realized what he had said, he nearly fouled himself. Even if it isn't, it would still rip Tanchico wide open. Do you really believe there is any need to buy trouble in this city? Tanchico was a rotting bell fruit ready to fall in the first wind. The whole of this wretched land was. For a moment she was tempted to buy his rumor. She was supposed to be a trader in whatever goods or information came along, and she had even sold some. But dealing with Gelb sickened her, and her own doubts frightened her. That will be all, Master Gelb. You know how to make contact with me if you find another of these. She touched the rough-woven sack. Instead of rising, he sat staring, trying to see through her mask. Where are you from, Mistress Elidar? The way you talk, all slurred out and soft-like, begging your pardon, no offense meant, I can't place you. That will be all, Gelb. Maybe it was the quarterdeck voice, or maybe the mask failed to hide her cold stare, but Gelb bounced to his feet, ducking bows and stammering apologies while he fumbled open the door in the lacework wall. She sat there after he was gone, giving him time to leave the Garden of Silver Breezes. Someone would follow him outside to make certain he did not wait to shadow her. All this skulking and hiding disgusted her. She almost wished something would destroy her disguise and give her an honest face-to-face fight. A new ship was sweeping into the harbor below, a seafolk raker with its towering masts and clouds of sail. She had examined a captured raker, but she would have given almost anything to take one out, though she expected a seafolk crew would be necessary to wring the most from the vessel. The Afa-an-Mier were stubborn about taking the oaths. It would not be as good if she had to buy a crew. Buy an entire crew. The amount of gold that came in by the courier boats for her to fling about was going to her head. Taking up the jute bag, she started to rise, then sat back down hurriedly at the sight of a wide, thick-shouldered man leaving another table. Dark hair long to his shoulders and a beard that left his upper lip bare framed Baal Domon's round face. He was not masked, of course. He ran a dozen coasting vessels in and out of Tanchico, and apparently did not care who knew his whereabouts. Masked. She was not thinking straight. He would not recognize her in a mask. Still, she waited until he was gone before leaving her table. The man might have to be dealt with yet, if he became a danger. Cylindrin took the gold she proffered with a sleek smile and murmured wishes for Egyanin's continued patronage. Dark hair and dozens of narrow braids, the proprietress of the Garden of Silver Breezes wore clinging white silk, nearly thin enough for a serving girl, and one of those transparent veils that always made Egyanin want to ask Taraboners what dances they could perform. Shay dancers wore almost identical veils and little more. Still, Egyanin thought as she started toward the street, the woman had a sharp mind, else she could not maneuver through the shoals of Tanchico, catering to every faction while earning the enmity of none. A reminder of that was the tall, white-cloaked man, gray at the temples but hard-faced and hard-eyed, who passed Egyanin and was greeted by Cylindrin. Jakim Karedin's cloak bore a golden sunburst on the breast, with 4 golden knots below and a crimson shepherd's crook behind. An inquisitor of the Hand of the Light, a high officer in the Children of the Light. The very concept of the children outraged Egianin, a military body answerable only to itself. But Karadin and his few hundred soldiers had power of a sort in Tanchico, where any kind of authority seemed to be lacking most of the time. The civil watch no longer patrolled the streets, and the army, as much as was still loyal to the king, was too busy holding the fortresses around the city. Egianin noted that Cylindrin did not even glance at the sword on Karadin's hip. He definitely had power. As soon as she stepped into the street, her bearers came running with her chair from the cluster waiting for their patrons, and her bodyguards closed in around her with their spears. They were a mismatched lot, some in steel caps, 3 wearing leather shirts sewn with steel scales, rough-faced men, possibly deserters from the army, but aware that continued full bellies and silver to spend depended on her continued safety. Even the bearers carried stout knives and cudgels stuck out of their sashes. No one who looked as though they had money dared appear out of doors unguarded. In any case, had she cared to risk it, it would only draw attention to her. The guards forced a way through the crowds with no trouble. The throngs eddied and swirled in the narrow streets that wound through the city's hills, creating clear pockets around sedan chairs surrounded by bodyguards. There were very few carriages to be seen. Horses were becoming an extravagance. Worn was the only fit description for the milling masses. Worn and frenzied. Worn faces, worn clothes, and 2 bright, frenzied eyes, desperate, hoping when they knew there was no hope. Many had surrendered, crouching against walls, huddled in doorways, clutching wives, husbands, children, not simply worn but ragged and blank-faced. Sometimes they roused enough to cry out to some passer-by for a coin, a crust, anything. Egianin kept her eyes straight ahead, of necessity trusting the bodyguards to detect any danger. Meeting a beggar's eyes meant 20 of them jamming themselves hopefully around her chair. Tossing a coin meant 100 crowding in, clamoring and weeping. She was already using part of the money the courier boats brought to support a soup kitchen, just as if she were one of the blood. She shuddered to think what discovery of that overstepping of her place would mean. As well put on a brocaded robe and shave her head. All of this could be put aright once Tanchico fell, with everyone fed, everyone put in their proper place, and she could abandon dresses and things she had no experience or taste for, return to her ship. Tarabon at least, and perhaps Arad Doman as well, were ready to crumble at a touch, like charred silk. Why was the High Lady Suroth holding back? Why?
Jakim Karadin lounged in his chair, cloak spread over the carved arms, studying the Tarabana noblemen who occupied the private room's other chairs. They sat stiffly in their gold-embroidered coats, mouths tight below masks, fancifully worked to resemble hawks' faces and lions and leopards. He had more to worry him than they, but he managed a calm demeanor. It was 2 months since he had received word of a cousin found skinned alive in his own bedchamber, 3 since his youngest sister, Dialda, being carried off from a bridal feast by a murdrawl. The family steward wrote disbelievingly, frantic with all the tragedy befalling House Karadin. 2 months. He hoped Dialda had died quickly. It was said women did not cling to sanity long in murdrawl hands. 2 whole months. Anyone else but Jakim Karadin would have been sweating blood. Each man held a golden goblet of wine, but there were no servants present. Cylindrin had served them before removing herself with an assurance that they would not be disturbed. There was, in fact, no one else on this, the highest floor of the Garden of Silver Breezes. 2 men who had come with the nobles, members of the king's lifeguard, unless Karadin missed his guess, stood at the foot of the stairs to guarantee continued privacy. Karadin sipped his wine. None of the Taraboners had touched theirs. So, he said lightly, King Andric wishes the Children of the Light to aid in restoring order in the city. We do not often let ourselves become involved in the internal affairs of nations. Not openly. Certainly, I cannot remember such a request. I do not know what the Lord Captain Commander will say. Pedron Nile would say to do what was needed and make sure the Taraboners knew that they owed a debt to the children. Make sure they paid it in full. There is no time for you to request instructions from Amador, the man in a black-spotted leopard mask said urgently. None had offered names, but Cardin did not need them. We ask what is necessary, another snapped, his thick mustache below a hawk mask giving him the look of a peculiar owl. You must understand that we would not make this request unless it were necessary in the extreme. We must have unity, not more division, yes? There are many divisive elements, even within Tanchico. They must be suppressed if there is to be even the hope of imposing peace on the countryside. The death of the Panarch has made matters most difficult, the first fellow added. Karadin raised an eyebrow questioningly. Have you discovered yet who killed her? His own supposition was that Andric himself had had the deed done, in the belief that the Panarch favored one of the rebel claimants to the throne. The king may have been right, but he had discovered after calling what he could of the Assembly of Lords, a good many were with one or another of the rebel groups out in the country, that they were remarkably stubborn about ratifying his choice. Even had the Lady Amathera not been currently sharing Andric's bed, election of king and Panarch was the only real power the Assembly had, and they did not seem to want to give it up. The difficulties over the Lady Amathera were not supposed to be known. Even the Assembly realized that that news might set off riots. One of the dragon-sworn madmen, assuredly, the owl-looking man said, giving his mustache a fierce tug. No true Taraboner would harm the Panarch, yes? He almost sounded as if he believed it. Of course, Karadin said smoothly. He took another sip of wine. If I am to secure the Panarch's palace for the ascension of the Lady Amathera, I must hear from the king himself. Otherwise, it might appear that Children of the Light were reaching for power in Tarabon, when all we seek is, as you say, an end to division and peace under the light. An older, square-jawed leopard, white streaking his dark yellow hair, spoke up in cold tones. I have heard that Pedron Nile seeks unity against the dragon-sworn. Unity under himself, is it not? The Lord Captain Commander seeks no dominion, Karadin replied, just as icily. The children serve the light, as do all men of goodwill. There can be no question, the first leopard put in, of Tarabon being subject in any way to Amador. No question. Angry agreement rumbled from nearly every chair. Of course not, Karadin said, as though the thought had never crossed his mind. If you wish my aid, I will give it, under the conditions I have stated. If you do not, there is always work for the children. Service to the light never ends, for the shadow waits everywhere. You will have sureties signed and sealed by the king, a graying, lion-masked man said, the first words he had spoken. He was, of course, Andric himself, though Karadin was not supposed to know. The king could not meet with an inquisitor of the Hand of the Light without causing talk, any more than he could visit a wine shop, even the Garden of Silver Breezes. Karadin nodded. When they are in my hand, I will secure the Panarch's palace, and the children will suppress any divisive elements who attempt to interfere with the investiture. Under the light, I swear it. Tension drained out of the Taraboners visibly. They upended their goblets as if trying to replace it with wine. Even Andric. So far as the people of Tarabon were concerned, the children would have the blame for the inevitable killings, not the king, or the army of Tarabon. Once Amathera was invested with the crown and staff of the tree, a few more of the assembly might well join the rebels. But if the rest admitted they had not elected her, the news would set Tanchico afire. As for any tales that came from those who fled, why, rebels would spread any sort of treasonous lie. And the king and panarch of Tarabon would both dangle on strings Karadin could hand to Pedron Nile to do with as he pleased. Not such a grand prize as it would have been when the king of Tarabon controlled more than a few hundred square miles around Tanchico, yet it might be grand again. With the aid of the children, a legion or two would be needed at least, not just the 500 men Karadin had. The dragon-sworn might yet be crushed, the various rebels defeated, even the war with Arad-Doman successfully prosecuted, if either country still realized it was fighting the other. Arad-Doman was in worse condition than Tarabon, so Karadin had heard. In truth, he hardly cared if Tarabon fell under the children's sway, or Tanchico, or any of it. There were motions to go through, things to do that he had always done, but it was difficult to think of anything except when his own throat would be cut. Perhaps he would long to have his throat cut. 2 whole months since the last report. He did not stay to drink with the Taraboners, but made his goodbyes as shortly as he could. If they took offense, they needed him too much to show it. Salindrin saw him come down, and a stable boy was trotting his horse up to the front door when he reached the street. Tossing the boy a copper, he spurred the black gelding to a quick canter. The ragged folk in the twisty streets got out of his way, which was to the good. He was not sure he would notice if he trampled one of them. Not that it would be any loss. The city was full of beggars. He could hardly breathe without the stench of old sour sweat and dirt. Tamarin ought to sweep them up and sweep them out. Let the rebels in the country contend with them. It was the country that held his mind, but not the rebels. They could be dealt with easily enough, after word began to spread that this one or that was a dark friend. And once he managed to turn a few of them over to the hand of the light, they would stand up before everyone and confess to worshiping the Dark One, eating children, anything and everything they were told. The rebels could not last long after that. The pretenders, still in the field, would wake to find themselves alone. But the dragon-sworn, the men and women who had actually declared for the Dragon Reborn, would not fall away for a charge of being dark friends. Most people already considered them so, swearing to follow a man who could channel. It was the man they had sworn to follow who was the problem. The man whose name they did not even know. Randall Thor.
Need to get a refill.
100 bands of dragons sworn out there, at least 2 large enough to be called armies, fighting the king's army, such of it still held allegiance to Andric, fighting the rebels, who were busy fighting each other as often as Andric or the Dragonsworn. Yet Karadin had no clue to which band sheltered Randall Thor. He could be on Almuth Plain or in Arad-Doman, where the situation was the same. If he was, Jakim Karadin was a dead man in all likelihood. At the palace on the Varana he had commandeered for the children's headquarters, he tossed his reins to one of the white-cloaked guards and stalked inside without returning their salutes. The owner of this ornate mass of pale domes and lacy spires and shaded gardens had put forward a claim to the throne of the light, and no one complained at the occupation. Least of all the owner. What was left of his head still adorned a spike above the traitor's steps on the Meseta. For once Karadin barely glanced at the fine Tarabon carpets, or furnishings worked with gold and ivory, or fountained courts where splashing water made a cool sound. Broad hallways with golden lamps and high ceilings covered in delicate goldwork scrolls interested him not at all. This palace could match the finest in Amadisia, if not the largest. Yet foremost in his mind right then was the strong brandy in the room he had taken for a study. He was halfway across a priceless carpet, all patterned blue and scarlet and gold, eyes fixed on the carved cabinet that held a silver flask of double-distilled brandy, when suddenly he realized he was not alone. A woman in a clinging pale red gown stood near the tall, narrow windows overlooking one of the tree-shaded gardens, her honey-colored hair in braids that brushed her shoulders. A misty scrap of veil did nothing to hide her face. Young and pretty, with a rosebud mouth and large brown eyes, she was no servant, not dressed like that. "Who are you?" he demanded irritably. "How did you get in here? Leave at once, or I'll have you tossed into the street." "Threats, Bors? You should be more welcoming to a guest, yes?" That name jolted him to his heels. Before he thought, he had his sword out, lunging for her throat. Something seized him. The air turned to crawling jelly. Something forced him to his knees, encased him from the neck down. It tightened around his wrist until bones grated. His hand popped open, and his sword fell. The power. She was using the one power on him. A Tarvalan witch. And if she knew that name... "Do you remember," she said, coming closer, "a meeting where Baalzamon himself appeared and showed us the faces of Matrim Cothan and Peranebara and Randall Thor?" She practically spat the names, especially the last. Her eyes could have drilled holes in steel. "You see, I know who you are, yes? You pledged your soul to the great lord of the Dark Boars." Her sudden laugh was a tinkling of bells. Sweat popped out on his face. Not just a despised Tarvalan witch. Black Aja. She was Black Aja. He had thought it would be a Murdral that came for him. He had thought there was time yet. More time. Not yet. "I tried to kill him," he babbled. "Randall Thor, I have tried, but I cannot find him. I cannot. I was told my family would be killed if I failed, one by one. I was promised I would be the last. I have cousins yet, nephews, nieces. I have another sister. You must give me more time." She stood there, watching him with those sharp brown eyes, smiling with that plump little mouth, listening to him spew out where Venora could be found, where her bedchamber lay, how she liked to ride alone in the forest beyond Chimera. Perhaps if he shouted, some of the guards would come. Perhaps they could kill her. He opened his mouth wider, and that thick, invisible jelly oozed in, forcing his jaws apart until they creaked in his ears. Nostrils flaring, he sucked air in frantically. He could still breathe, but he could not scream. All that came out were muffled groans, like a woman wailing behind walls. He wanted to scream. "You are very amusing," the honey-haired woman said finally. "Jacob? That is a good name for a dog, I think. Would you like to be my dog, Jacob? If you are a very good dog, I may allow you to watch Randall Thor die one day. Yes?" It took a moment for what she was saying to sink in. If he was to see Randall Thor die, she was not going to kill him, skin him alive, do the things his mind had conjured that would make flaying a release. Tears rolled down his face. Sobs of relief shook him, as much as he could shake, trapped as he was. That trap abruptly vanished, and he collapsed on hands and knees, still weeping. He could not stop. The woman knelt beside him and tangled a hand in his hair, pulled his head up. "Now, you listen to me, yes? The death of Randolph Thor is for the future, and you will see it only if you are a good dog. You are going to move your white cloaks to the Panarch's palace. How do you know that? She shook his head from side to side, not gently. A good dog does not question his mistress. I throw the stick, you fetch the stick. I say kill, you kill. Yes, yes. Her smile was just a flash of teeth. There will be difficulty in taking the palace. The Panarch's legion is there. 1,000 men sleeping in the hallways, the exhibition rooms, the courtyards. You do not have so many of your white cloaks. He had to stop and swallow. They will make no trouble. They will believe Amathera has been chosen by the Assembly. It is the Assembly that... Do not bore me, Jacob. I do not care if you kill the entire Assembly, so long as you hold the Panarch's palace. When will you move? It will take 3 or 4 days for Andric to deliver sureties. 3 or 4 days, she murmured, half to herself. Very well. A little longer delay should cause no harm. He was wondering what delay she meant when she cut away the little ground remaining under his feet. You will keep control of the palace, and you will send the Panarch's fine soldiers away. That is impossible, he gasped. And she jerked his head back so hard he did not know if his neck would break or his scalp tear loose first. He did not dare resist. 1,000 invisible needles pricked him, on his face, his chest, his back, arms, legs, everywhere. Invisible, but he was sure no less real for that. Impossible, Jacob, she said softly. Impossible is a word I do not like to hear. The needles twisted deeper. He groaned, but he had to explain. What she wanted was impossible. He panted with haste. Once Amathera is invested as Panarch, she will control the Legion. If I try to hold the palace, she will turn them on me, and Andric will help her. There is no way I can hold it against the Panarch's Legion and against whatever Andric can strip from the ring forts. She studied him so long, he began to sweat. He did not dare to flinch, hardly even to blink. Those 1,000 biting little stabs did not allow it. The Panarch will be dealt with, she said finally. The needles vanished, and she stood. Karadin stood too, trying to steady himself. Perhaps some bargain could be reached. The woman seemed willing to listen to reason now. His legs quivered with shock, but he made his voice as firm as he could. Even if you can influence Amathera, she cut him off. I told you not to question Jacob. A good dog obeys his mistress, yes? I promise you, if you do not, you will beg me to find a murderol to play with you. Do you understand me? I understand, he said leadenly. She continued to stare, and after a moment he did understand. I will do as you say, mistress. Her brief, approving smile made him flush. She moved toward the door, turning her back on him, as if he really were a dog, and a toothless one. What is your name? Her smile was sweet this time, and mocking. Yes, a dog should know his mistress's name. I am called Leandrin, but that name must never touch a dog's lips. Should it, I will be most displeased with you. When the door closed behind her, he staggered to a high-backed chair inlaid with ivory and fell into it. The brandy he left where it was. The way his stomach was twisting, it would make him vomit. What interest could she possibly have in the Panarch's palace? A dangerous line of questioning, perhaps, but even if they served the same master, it was not anything but revulsion for a Tarvalan. She did not know as much as she thought. With the king's sureties in hand, he could keep Tamrin and the army away from his throat with the threat of revelation, and Amathera, too. They could still rouse the mob, though, and the Lord Captain Commander might be more than disapproving of the entire affair, might believe he was reaching for personal power. Karadin dropped his head in his hands, envisioning Niall signing his death warrant. His own men would arrest him and hang him. If he could arrange the death of the witch. But she had promised to protect him from the Murdraw. He wanted to weep again. She was not even here, yet she had him trapped as tightly as ever. Steel jaws clamped on both legs and a noose snug around his neck. There had to be no way, but every way he looked, there was only another trap.
Leandrin ghosted through the halls, easily avoiding servants and white cloaks. When she stepped out of a small back door into a narrow alley behind the palace, the tall young guard there stared at her with a blend of relief and unease. Her little trick of opening someone to her suggestions, just a whip-crack trickle of the power, had not been needed with Karadin, but it had easily convinced this fool that she should be allowed in. Smiling, she motioned him to bend closer. The lanky lout grinned as if expecting a kiss, a grin that froze as her narrow blade went through his eyes. She leaped nimbly back as he fell, a boneless sack of flesh. He would not speak of her even by accident now. Not so much as a spot of blood stained her hand. She wished she had Chesmal's skill at killing with the power, or even Rihanna's lesser talent. Strange that the ability to kill with the power, to stop a heart or boil blood in the veins, should be so closely linked to healing. She herself could not heal much more than scrapes or bruises. Not that she had any interest in it. Her sedan chair, red-lacquered and inlaid with ivory and gold, was waiting at the end of the alley, and with it her bodyguards, a dozen big men with faces like starving wolves. Once in the streets, they traded hats through crowds with ease, spears clubbing any not quick enough to make a stand. They were all dedicated to the great lord of the West, and if they did not know exactly who he was, they knew that other men didn't either, men who failed to serve. The house she and the girls had taken, two sprawling stories of flat-roofed stone and white plaster on a hillside at the base of the Varana, the easternmost peninsula, belonged to a merchant who had also sold slaves to the great lord. Leandrin would have preferred a palace. One day, perhaps, she would have the king's palace on the Meseta. She had grown up staring enviously at the lord's palaces, but why should she settle for one of them? Yet, despite her preferences, it made sense to stay hidden a while yet. There was no way the fools in Tarvalin could suspect they were in Tarabon. Kyle was surely still hunting them, and Swan Sanchez' pets could be sniffing anywhere. Gates gave onto a small courtyard, windowless except on the upper floor. Leaving the guards and bearers there, she hurried inside. The merchant had furnished a few servants, all sworn to the great lord, he assured them, but barely enough to provide for 11 women who rarely stirred outside. One, a sturdily handsome and dark-bearded woman called Gildan, was sweeping the entry hall's red and white tiles when Leandrin entered. "Where are the others?" she demanded. "In the front withdrawing room." Gildan gestured to the double-arched doors to the right, as though Leandrin might not know where that was. Leandrin's mouth. The woman did not curtsy. She used no titles of respect. True, she did not know who Leandrin really was, but Gildan certainly knew she was to give orders and be obeyed, to send that fat merchant bowing and scraping and bundling his family off to some hovel. "You are supposed to be cleaning this. Not standing about? Well, clean. There is dust everywhere. If I find a speck of the dust this evening, you cow, you, I will have you beaten." She clamped her teeth shut. She had copied the manner in which the nobles and the wealthy spoke for so long that sometimes she forgot her father had sold fruit from a barrow. Yet in one moment of anger, the speech of a commoner rolled off her tongue. Too much stress, too much waiting. With a last snapped "work," she pushed into the withdrawing room and slammed the door behind her. The others were not all there, which irritated her even more, but enough. round-faced Eldrith Jondar, seated at a lapis-inlaid table beneath the hanging on one white-plastered wall, was making careful notes from a tattered manuscript. Sometimes she absently cleaned the nib of her pen on the sleeve of her dark wool dress. Marilyn Morgan sat beside one of the narrow windows, blue eyes dreamily staring out at the tiny fountain tinkling in a little courtyard, idly scratching the ears of a scrawny yellow cat, and apparently unaware of the hairs it shed all over her green silk dress. She and Eldrith were both Browns, but if Marilyn ever found out that Eldrith was the reason the stray cats she brought in continually disappeared, there would be trouble. They had been Browns. Sometimes it was difficult to remember they no longer were, or that she herself was no longer a Red. So much of what had marked them clearly as members of their old Ajas remained, even now that they were openly pledged to black. Take the two former Greens. Coppery-skinned, swan-necked Jian Kaida wore the thinnest, most clinging silk dresses she could find, white today, and laughed that the gowns would have to do, since there was nothing available in Tarabon to catch a man's eye. Jian was from Arad Doman. Domani women were infamous for their scandalous clothes. Asni Zeramin, with her dark tilted eyes and bold nose, looked almost familiar in pale gray, cut and high neck. But Leandrin had heard her regret leaving her warders behind more than once. And as for Rihanna and Domaran, black hair with a stark white streak above her left ear framed a face with the cold, arrogant certainty only a white could assume. "It is done," Leandrin announced. J. Kim Karadin will move his white cloaks to the Panarch's palace and hold it for us. He does not yet know we will have guests, of course. There were a few grimaces. Changing Ajas had certainly not altered anyone's feelings toward men who hated women who could channel. There is an interesting thing. He believed I was there to kill him, for failing to kill Randall Thor. That makes no sense, Asni said, frowning. We are to bind him, control him, not kill him. She laughed suddenly, soft and low, and leaned back in her chair. If there is a way to control him, I would not mind binding him to me. He is a good-looking young man, from the little I saw. Leandrin sniffed. She had no liking for men at all. Rihanna shook her head worriedly. It makes troubling sense. Our orders from the tower were clear, yet it is also clear that Karadin has others. I can only postulate dissension among the Forsaken. The Forsaken, Jian muttered, folding her arms tightly. Thin white silk molded her breasts even more revealingly. What good are promises that we will rule the world when the Great Lord returns, if we are crushed between warring Forsaken first? Does anyone believe we could stand against any of them? Balefire. Asner looked around, dark tilted eyes challenging. Balefire will destroy even one of the Forsaken, and we have to use it. One of the Turangrial they had removed from the tower, a fluted black rod a pace long, had that use. None of them knew why they had been ordered to take it, not even Leandrin herself. Too many of the Turangrial were like that, taken because they had been told to, with no reasons given, but some orders had to be obeyed. Leandrin wished they had been able to secure even one Angrial. Jian gave a sharp sniff. If any of us could control it. Or have you forgotten that the one test we dared nearly killed me, and burned a hole through both sides of the ship before I could stop it? Fine good it would have done us to drown before reaching Tanchico. What need have we of balefire? Leandrin said. If we can control the Dragon Reborn, let the Forsaken think how they will deal with us. Suddenly she became aware of another presence in the room. The woman Gildan, wiping down a carved, low-backed chair in one corner. What are you doing here, woman? Cleaning. The dark-braided woman straightened unconcernedly. You told me to clean. Leandrin almost struck out with the power. Almost. But Gildan certainly did not know they were Aes Sedai. How much had the woman heard? Nothing of importance. "You will go to the cook," she said in a cold fury, "and tell him he is to strap you very hard, and you are to have nothing to eat until the dust it is all gone." Again. The woman had made her speak like a commoner again. Marilyn stood, nuzzling the yellow cat's nose with hers, and handed the creature to Gildan. "See that he gets a dish of cream when the cook is done with you, and some of that nice lamb. Cut it small for him. He doesn't have many teeth left, poor thing." Gildan looked at her, not blinking, and she added, "Is there something you don't understand?" "I understand." Gildan's mouth was tight. Perhaps she did finally understand. She was a servant, not their equal. Liandrin waited a moment after she left, the cat cradled in her arms, then snatched open one of the doors. The entry hall was empty. Gildan was not eavesdropping. She did not trust the woman, but then she could not think of anyone she did trust. "We must be concerned with what concerns us," she said tightly, closing the door. "Eldrith, have you found a new clue in those pages? Eldrith?" The plump woman gave a start, then stared around at them, blinking. It was the first time she had raised her head from the battered yellow manuscript. She seemed surprised to see Liandrin. "What? Clue? Oh, no. It is difficult enough getting into the king's library. If I extracted so much as a page, the librarians would know it immediately. But if I disposed of them, I would never find anything. That place is a maze. No, I found this in a bookseller's near the king's palace. It is an interesting treatise on—" Embracing Saidar, Liandrin sent the pages showering across the floor. "Unless they are a treatise on the controlling of Randall Thor, let them be burned. What have you learned about what we seek?" Eldrith blinked at the scattered papers. "Well, it is in the Panarch's palace. You learned that 2 days ago. And it must be a ter'angreal. To control someone who can channel must require the power, and since it is a specialized use, that means a ter'angreal. We will find it in the exhibition room, or perhaps among the Panarch's collection." "Something new, Eldrith." With an effort, Liandrin made her voice less shrill. "Have you found anything that is new?" "Anything?" The round-faced woman blinked uncertainly. "Actually, no." "It does not matter," Marilyn said. "In a few days, once they have invested their precious Panarch, we can begin searching, and if we must inspect every candlestick, we will find it. We are on the brink, Liandrin. We will put Randall Thor on a leash and teach him to sit up and roll over." "Oh, yes," Eldrith said, smiling happily. "On a leash." Liandrin hoped it was so. She was tired of waiting, tired of hiding. Let the world know her. Let people bend knee as had been promised when she first forswore old oaths for new. Egyanin knew she was not alone as soon as she stepped into her small house by the kitchen door, but she dropped her mask and the jute bag carelessly on the table and walked over to where a bucket of water stood beside the brick fireplace. As she bent to take the copper ladle, her right hand darted into a low hollow where 2 bricks had been removed behind the bucket. She spun erect, a small crossbow in her hand. No more than a foot long, it had little power or range, but she always kept it drawn, and the dark stain tipping the sharp steel bolt would kill in a heartbeat. If the man leaning casually in the corner saw the crossbow, he gave no outward sign. He was pale-haired and blue-eyed, in his middle years, and good-looking if too slender for her taste. Clearly he had watched her cross the narrow yard through the iron-grilled window beside him. "Do you think that I threaten you?" he said after a moment. She recognized the familiar accents of home, but she did not lower the crossbow. "Who are you?" For answer, he dipped 2 fingers carefully into his belt pouch. Apparently he could see, after all. and brought out something small and flat. She motioned him to lay it on the table and back up again. Only after he was back in the corner did she move close enough to pick up what he had set there. Never taking her eyes or the crossbow away from him, she lifted it up where she could see. A small ivory plaque, bordered in gold, engraved with a raven and a tower. The raven's eyes were black sapphires. A raven, symbol of the imperial family, the Tower of Ravens, symbol of imperial justice. Normally this would be enough, she told him, but we are far from Shan-Chan, in a land where the bizarre is almost commonplace. What other proof can you offer? Smiling with silent amusement, he removed his coat, unlaced his shirt, and stripped it off. On either shoulder was the tattoo of raven and tower. Most seekers for truth bore the ravens as well as the tower, but not even someone who dared steal a seeker's plaque would have himself marked so. To wear the ravens was to be the property of the imperial family. There was an old story of a fool young lord and lady who had themselves tattooed while drunk, some 300 years gone. When the then empress learned of it, she had them brought to the court of the 9 moons and set to scrubbing floors. This fellow might be one of their descendants. The mark of the raven was forever. My apologies, Seeker, she said, setting the crossbow down. Why are you here? She did not ask a name. Any he gave might or might not be his. He left her holding the plaque while he redressed himself in a leisurely manner, a subtle reminder. She was a captain and he property, but he was also a seeker, and under the law he could have her put to the question on his own authority. By law he had the right to send her out to buy the rope to bind her while he put her to the question right here, and he would expect her to return with it. Flight from a seeker was a crime. Refusal to cooperate with a seeker was a crime. She had never in her life considered any criminal act, no more than she had considered treason against the Crystal Throne. But if he asked the wrong questions, demanded the wrong answers, the crossbow was still close to her hand, and Kantorin was far away. Wild thoughts, dangerous thoughts. I serve the High Lady Suroth and the Korena for the Empress, he said. I am checking on the progress of the agents the High Lady has placed in these lands. Checking? What had to be checked, and by a seeker? I have heard nothing of this from the courier boats. His smile deepened, and she flushed. Of course the crews would not speak of a seeker, yet he answered while lacing up his shirt. The courier boats are not to be risked with my trips. I have taken passage on the vessels of a local smuggler, a man called Baal Doman. His craft stop everywhere in Tarabon and Arad Doman and between. I have heard of him, she said calmly. All goes well? It does now. I am glad that you at least understood your instructions properly. Among the others, only the Seekers did. It is regrettable that there are not more Seekers with the Hylian. Settling his coat on his shoulders, he plucked the Seeker's plaque from her hand. There has been some embarrassment over the return of Suldam deserters. Such desertions must not become common knowledge. Much better that they simply vanish. Only because she had a little time to think was she able to keep her face smooth. Suldam had been left behind in the debacle at Falma, she had been told. Possibly some had deserted. Her instruction, delivered by the High Lady Suroth herself, had been to return any who could be found, whether they wanted to return or not, and if that was not possible, dispose of them. The last had seemed only a final alternative, until now. I regret that these lands do not know Kaf, he said, taking a seat at the table. Even in Kantorin, only the Bloods still have Kaf, or it was so when I left. Perhaps supply ships have arrived from Shan-Chan since. Tea must do. Fix me tea. She very nearly knocked him out of his chair. The man was property, and a seeker. She brewed tea, and served it to him, standing beside his chair with the pot to keep his cup full. She was surprised he did not ask her to don a veil and dance on the table. She was permitted to sit at last, after fetching pen and ink and paper, but only to sketch maps of Tanchico and its defenses, to draw every other city and town she knew the least thing about. She listed the various forces in the field, as much as she knew of their strengths and loyalties, what she had deduced of their dispositions. When she was done, he stuffed it all in his pocket, told her to send the contents of the jute sack by the next courier boat, and left with one of those amused smiles, saying he might check on her progress again in a few weeks. She sat there for a long time after he was gone. Every map she had drawn, every list she had made, duplicated papers sent out by courier boats long since. Having her do it all again while he watched might have been a punishment for forcing him to show his tattoos. Death Watch guards flaunted their ravens. Seekers rarely did. It might have been that. At least he had not gone down to the basement before she arrived. Or had he? Had he just been waiting for her to speak? The stout iron lock hung seemingly undisturbed on the door in the hall just beyond the kitchen, but it was said Seekers knew how to open locks without keys. Taking the key from her belt pouch, she unfastened the lock and went down the narrow steps. One lamp on a shelf lit the dirt-floored basement. Just 4 brick walls, cleared of everything that might help an escape. A faint smell of the slop pail hung in the air. On the side opposite the lamp, a woman in a dirty dress sat despondently on a few rough woolen blankets, her head lifted at the sound of Egyanin's steps, dark eyes fearful and pleading. She had been the first Suldam Egyanin had found, the first, the only. Egyanin had all but stopped looking after she found Bethamen, and Bethamen had been in this basement since, while courier boats came and went. "Did anyone come down here?" Egyanin said. "No. I heard footsteps overhead, but no." Bethamen stretched out her hands. "Please, Egyanin, this is all a mistake. You have known me for 10 years. Take this thing off of me." A silver collar encircled her neck, attached by a thick silver leash to a bracelet of the same metal that hung on a peg a few feet above her head. It had been almost an accident, putting it on her, simply a means of securing her for a few moments, and then she had managed to knock Egyanin down, trying a dash for freedom. "If you bring it to me, I will," Egyanin said angrily. She was angry with many things, not with Bethamen. "Bring the Idam over here, and I will remove it." Bethamen shivered, let her hands fall. "It is a mistake," she whispered. "A horrible mistake." But she made no move toward the bracelet. Her first attempted flight had left her writhing on the floor upstairs, racked by nausea, and had left Egyanin stunned. Suldam controlled Damani, women who could channel by means of Idam. It was Damani who could channel, not Suldam. But an Idam could only control a woman who could channel. No other woman, and not a man. Young men with that ability were executed, of course. Only a woman who could channel. A woman who had that ability and was collared could not move more than a few steps without her bracelet on the wrist of a Suldam to complete the link. Egyanin felt very tired climbing the stairs and locking the door again. She wanted some tea herself, but the little the Seeker had left was cold, and she did not feel like brewing more. Instead, she sat down and pulled the Idam out of the jute bag. To her it was only finely jointed silver. She could not use it, and it could not harm her unless somebody hit her with it. Even linking herself with an Idam that far, denying its ability to control her, was enough to send a shiver down her spine. Women who could channel were dangerous animals rather than people. It had been they who broke the world. They must be controlled, or they would turn everyone into their property. That was what she had been taught, what had been taught in Shanchan for 1,000 years. Strange that that seemed not to have happened here. No, that was a dangerous, foolish line of thought. Tucking the idam back into the bag, she cleaned the tea things to settle her mind. She liked tidiness, and there was a small satisfaction in making the kitchen so. Before she realized it, she was brewing a pot of tea for herself. She did not want to think about Bethamin, and that was dangerously foolish, too. Settling herself back at the table, she stirred honey into a cup of tea as black as she could make it. Not calf, but it would do. Despite her denials, despite her pleas, Bethamin could channel. Could other Suldam? Was that why the High Lady Suroth wanted those left behind at Falmouth killed? It was unthinkable. It was impossible. The yearly testings all across Shanshan found every girl who had the spark of channeling in her. Each was struck from the rolls of citizens, struck from family records, taken away to become collared Damani. The same testings found the girls who could learn to wear the bracelet of the Suldam. No woman escaped being tested each year until she was old enough that she would have begun channeling if the spark was there. How could even one girl be taken for Suldam when she was Damani? Yet there Bethamin was in the basement, held by an idam and by an anchor. One thing was certain. The possibilities here were potentially deadly. This involved the blood and seekers. Maybe even the Crystal Throne. Would the High Lady Suroth dare keep knowledge of this sort from the Empress? A mere ship captain could die screaming for a misplaced frown in that company, or find herself property for a whim. She had to know more if she hoped to avoid the death of 10,000 tears. To begin with, that meant spreading more money to Gelb and other ferrety skulkers like him, finding more Suldam and seeing if Idam held them. Beyond that, she was sailing uncharted reefs with no linesman in the bow. Touching the crossbow still lying there with its lethal bolt, she realized that something else was certain. She was not going to let the Seekers kill her, not just to help the High Lady Suroth keep a secret, perhaps not for any reason. It was a thought shiveringly close to treason, but it would not go away. Chapter 39. A Cup of Wine. When Elaine came on deck with her things neatly bundled, the setting sun seemed to be just touching the water out beyond the mouth of Tanchico's harbor, and the final thick hawsers were being tied to snug wave dancer to a ship-line dock, only one of many along this westernmost peninsula of the city. Some of the crew were furling the last sails. Beyond the long wharves, the city rose on hills, shining white, domed and spired, with polished weather vanes glittering. Perhaps a mile north she could make out high, round walls, the Great Circle, if she remembered correctly. Slinging her bundle on the same shoulder as her leather script, she went to join Nynaeve by the gangplank, with Coeen and Jorin. It seemed almost odd to see the sisters fully dressed again, in bright brocaded silk blouses that matched their wide trousers. Earrings and even nose rings she'd become used to, and the fine gold chain across each woman's dark cheek hardly made her wince at all now. Tom and Julian stood apart with their own bundles, looking a touch sullen. Nynaeve had been right. They had tried to second-guess, starting when the real purpose of this journey, or some of it, was revealed to them 2 days ago. Neither seemed to think two young women were competent to seek the Black Aja. A threat by Nynaeve to have them transferred to another seafolk ship, headed the other way, had nipped that in the bud. At least it had once Toram and a dozen crewmen gathered, ready to shove them into a boat to be rowed across. Elaine gave them a searching look. Sullenness meant rebellion. They were going to have more trouble from these two. "Where will you go now, Coeen?" Nynaeve was asking as Elaine reached them. "Through Dan Torah and the Isle Jafar," the sail mistress replied, "and then on to Cantorin and the Isle Somira, spreading news of the Coromor, if it pleases the light. But I must allow Toram to trade here, or he will burst." Her husband was down on the docks now, without his strange wire-framed lens, bare-chested and beringed, talking earnestly with men in baggy white trousers, and coats embroidered with scroll work on the shoulders. Each Tanchikan wore a dark cylindrical cap and a transparent veil across his face. The veils looked ridiculous, especially on the men with thick mustaches. "The light send you a safe voyage," Nynaeve said, shifting her bundles on her back. "If we discover any danger here that might threaten you before we sail, we will send word." Coeen and her sister looked remarkably calm. Knowledge of the Black Aja hardly fazed them. It was the Coromor, Rand, who was important. Jorin kissed her fingertips and pressed them to Elaine's lips. "The light willing, we shall meet again." "The light willing," Elaine responded, duplicating the Windfinder's gesture. It still felt odd, but it was an honor, too, used only between close family members or lovers. She was going to miss the Sea Folk woman. She had learned a great deal, and taught a little as well. Jorin could certainly weave fire much better now. When they reached the foot of the gangplank, Nynaeve heaved a sigh of relief. An oily potion Jorin produced had settled her stomach after 2 days at sea, but all the same she had been tight-eyed and tight-mouthed until Tanchico came in sight. The two men bracketed them immediately, without any instructions, Julian taking the lead with his bundle on his back and his pale, thumb-thick staff held in both hands, dark eyes alert. Tom brought up the rear, somehow managing a dangerous look, despite his white hair and his limp and his gleeman's cloak. Nynaeve pursed her lips for a moment, but said nothing, which Elaine thought wise. Before they had gone 50 paces down the long stone dock, she had seen as many slitty-eyed, hungry-faced men studying them, and Tanchikans and others shifting crates and bales and sacks on the dock. She suspected any of them would have been willing to cut her throat, in the hope that a silk dress meant money in her purse. They did not frighten her. She could handle any 2 or 3 of them, she was sure. But she and Nynaeve had their great serpent rings in their pouches, and it would be useless to pretend no connection with the White Tower if she channeled in front of 100 men. Best if Julian and Tom looked as fierce as they could. She would not have minded having 10 more just like them. Suddenly, there was a roar from the deck of one of the smaller ships. "You! It do be you!" A wide, round-faced man in a green silk coat leaped onto the dock, ignoring Julian's raised staff, to stare at her and Nynaeve. A beard with no mustache marked him as an Illianer, and so did his accent. He seemed vaguely familiar. "Master Domon," Nynaeve said after a moment, giving her braid a sharp tug. "Bail Domon?" He nodded. "Aye. I never did think to see you again. I did wait as long as I could in Falma, but the time did come when I must sail or watch my ship burn." Elaine knew him now. He had agreed to carry them out of Falma, but chaos had seized that city before they could reach his vessel. That coat said he had done well since. "A pleasure to see you again," Nynaeve said coolly. "But if you will excuse us, we must find rooms in the city." "That will be hard. Tanchico do burst its caulking. I do know a place where my word may bring something, though. I could no remain longer in Falma, but I do feel I owe you some debt." Domon paused, frowning with sudden unease. "Your being here. Will the same happen here as in Falma, then?" "No, Master Domon," Elaine said, when Nynaeve hesitated. "Of course not, and we will be glad to accept your help." She half expected some protest out of Nynaeve, yet the older woman only nodded thoughtfully and made introductions among the men. Tom's cloak made Domon's eyebrows rise. For an instant she almost thought it looked as though he recognized the Gleeman, but Julian's tyrant garb brought a frown that was returned in kind. Neither man said anything, though. Perhaps they could keep the animosity between Tyr and Ilian out of Tanchico. If they could not, she would have to speak firmly with them. Domon talked of what had happened with him since Falma as he accompanied them down the dock, and he had indeed done well. "A dozen good coasting ships the Panarch's tacksmen do know about," he laughed. And for deep water, they do know. He could hardly have acquired so many honestly in so short a time. It shocked her to hear him speak so openly on a dock full of men. I do smuggle and make such profits as I did never believe. 1/10 the amount of the excise in the customs men's pockets do turn their eyes and seal their mouths. 2 Tanchikans in those veils and round hats strolled past, hands clasped behind their backs. Each wore a heavy brass key dangling from a thick chain about his neck. It had the look of a mark of office. They nodded to Domon in a familiar way. Tom looked amused, but Julian glared at Domon and the 2 Tanchikans equally. As a thief-catcher, he had a proper dislike of those who flouted the law. I do no believe it will last much longer, though, Domon said when the Tanchikans had passed. Things do be even worse in Aradoman than here, and it do be bad enough here. Perhaps the Lord Dragon does no break the world yet, but he did break Aradoman and Tarabon. Elaine wanted to say something sharp to him, but they had reached the foot of the dock, and she watched in silence while he hired sedan chairs and bearers, and a dozen men with stout staves and hard faces. Guards with swords and spears stood at the end of the dock, with the look of hired men, not soldiers. From across the wide street along the row of docks, hundreds of defeated, sunken faces stared at the guards. Sometimes eyes flickered toward the ships, but mainly they fixed on the men holding them back from those ships. Remembering what Coeen had said about people here mobbing her vessel, desperate to buy passage anywhere away from Tanchico, Elaine shivered. When these hungry eyes looked at the ships, need burned in them. Elaine sat rigidly in her chair as it jounced through the crowds behind prodding staves, and tried not to look at anything. She did not want to see those faces. Where was their king? Why was he not taking care of them? A sign above the gate of the white-plastered inn Domon took them to, below the great circle, proclaimed the Three-Plum Court. The only court Elaine saw was the high-walled courtyard, paved with flagstones in front of the inn, which was 3 square stories with no windows near the ground, and the upper windows grilled with fanciful ironwork. Inside, men and women crowded the common room, most in Tanchican clothes, and the buzz of voices nearly drowned out the tune of a hammered dulcimer. Nynaeve gasped at her first sight of the innkeeper, a pretty woman not much older than herself, with brown eyes and pale honey braids, her veil not hiding a plump rosebud of a mouth. Elaine gave a start, too, but it was not Leandrin. The woman, her name was Rendra, obviously knew Domon well. With welcoming smiles for Elaine and Nynaeve, and making much over Tom being a gleeman, she gave them her last 2 rooms, at what Elaine suspected might be less than the going rate. Elaine made sure she and Nynaeve got the one with the larger bed. She had shared a bed with Nynaeve before, and the woman was free with her elbows. Rendra also provided supper in a private room, laid out by 2 veiled young serving men. Elaine found herself staring at a plate of a roast lamb with spiced apple jelly and some sort of long yellowish beans prepared with pine nuts. She could not touch it. All those hungry faces. Domon ate readily enough, him and his smuggling and his gold. Tom and Julian showed no reticence either. Rendra, Nynaeve said quietly, does anyone here help the poor? I can lay my hands on a good bit of gold if it would help. You could donate to Baal's kitchen, the innkeeper replied, giving Domon a smile. The man avoids all of the taxes, yet he taxes himself. For each crown he gives as the bribe, he gives 2 for the soup and the bread for the poor. He has even talked me into giving, and I pay my taxes. It do be less than the taxes, Domon muttered, hunching his shoulders defensively. I do make a very healthy profit. Fortune prick me if I do know. It is good that you like to help people, Master Domon, Nynaeve said, when Rendra and the servants had gone. Tom and Julian both got up to see they really had gone. With a half bow, Tom let Julian open the door. The hall outside was empty. Nynaeve went right on. We may need your help, too. The Illianer's knife and fork paused in cutting a piece of lamb. How? He asked suspiciously. I do not know exactly, Master Doman. You have ships. You must have men. We may need ears and eyes. Some of the Black Aja may very well be in Tanchico, and we must find them if they are. Nynaeve lifted a forkful of beans to her mouth, as if she had said nothing out of the ordinary. She seemed to be telling everyone about the Black Aja of late. Doman gaped at her, then stared incredulously at Tom and Julian as they settled back in their chairs. When they nodded, he pushed his plate aside and put his head down on his arms. He very nearly earned himself a thump from
Nynaeve. How are you
if
doing?
the way her mouth tightened was any indication.
Good to see you.
And Elaine would not have blamed her. Why should he need them to confirm her word? Finally, Doman roused himself. It do be going to happen again. Falma all over.
How you been
It do be
doing,
time for me
17
to
as
pack
oil?
up and go. If I do take the ships I have back to Ilion, I will be a wealthy man there, too. I don't find Ilion congenial, Nynaeve told him in a firm voice. I understand that Samael rules there now, if not openly. You might not enjoy your wealth under one of the Forsaken. Doman's eyes nearly came out of his head, but she went right on. There are no safe places any longer. You can run like a rabbit, but you cannot hide. Is it not better to do what you can to fight back like a man? Nynaeve was being too hard. She always had to bully people. Elaine smiled and leaned over to put a hand on Doman's arm. We do not mean to browbeat you, Master Doman, but we truly may need your help. I know you for a brave man, else you would not have waited for us as long as you did at Falma. We will be most grateful. You do this very well, Doman muttered. One with an ox driver's stick, the other with a queen's honey. Oh, very well. I will help as I can, but I will no promise to remain for another Falma. Tom and Julian set in to question him closely about Tanchico as they ate. At least, Julian did in a roundabout manner, suggesting questions to Tom about what districts thieves and cut-purses and burglars frequented, what wine shops they used, and who bought their stolen goods. The thief-catcher maintained that such people often knew more of what was going on in a city than the authorities did. He did not seem to want to talk to the Illianer directly, and Doman snorted every time he answered one of the tyrant's questions put by Tom. He did not answer until they were put by Tom. Tom's own questions made no sense, at least not coming from a gleeman. He asked of nobles and factions, of who was allied to whom and who opposed, of who had what stated aims and what their actions brought about, and whether the results were different from what they supposedly wanted. Not the kind of questions she expected from him at all, even after all their conversations on Wave Dancer. He had been willing enough to talk with her, he even seemed to enjoy it, but somehow every time she thought she might dig out something about his past, that was just when he managed to put her back up and send her stalking away. Doman answered Tom with more alacrity than he did Julian. In either case, though, he seemed to know Tanchico very well, both its lords and officials, and its dark underbelly. As he talked, it often sounded as if there were little difference. Once the two men had wrung the smuggler dry, Nynaeve summoned Rendra to bring pen and ink and paper, and wrote out a list describing each of the Black Sisters. Holding the sheets gingerly in one big hand, Doman frowned at them uneasily, as though they were the women themselves, but he promised to have such of his men as were in port keep their eyes open. When Nynaeve reminded him that they should all take extreme care, he laughed, the way he would had she told him not to run himself through with a sword. Julian left on Doman's heels, twirling his pale staff and saying night was the best time to find thieves and people who lived off thieves. Nynaeve announced she was retiring to her room, to lie down a while. She looked a bit unsteady, and suddenly Elaine realized why. Nynaeve had become used to wave dancers heaving. Now she was having trouble with the ground not heaving. The woman's stomach was not a pleasant traveling companion. She herself followed Tom down to the common room where he had promised Rendra he would perform. For a wonder, she found a bench at an empty table, and cool looks sufficed to ward off the men who suddenly seemed to want to sit there. Rendra brought her a silver cup of wine, and she sipped as she listened to Tom play his harp, singing love songs like The First Rose of Summer and The Wind That Shakes the Willow, and funny songs like Only One Boot and The Old Gray Goose. His listeners were appreciative, slapping the tables for applause. After a while, Elaine slapped hers, too. She had not drunk more than half her wine, but a handsome young serving man smiled at her and filled it up. It was all strangely exciting. In her whole life, she had not been in an inn's common room half a dozen times, and never to sip wine and be entertained like one of the common people. Flourishing his cloak to set the multi-hued patches fluttering, Tom told stories, Mara and the Three Foolish Kings, and several tales about Anla, the wise counselor, and recited a long stretch of the great hunt of the Horn, reciting it so that horses seemed to prance and trumpets blare in the common room, and men and women fought and loved and died. On into the night he sang and recited, only pausing now and then to wet his throat with a sip of wine, as the patrons eagerly clamored for more. The woman who had been playing the dulcimer sat in a corner with her instrument on her knees and a sour expression on her face. People often tossed coins to Tom. He had enlisted a small boy to gather them up, and it was unlikely they had produced as much for her music. It all seemed to suit Tom, the harp, and especially the recital. Well, he was a glee man, but it seemed more than that. Elaine could have sworn she had heard him recite the great hunt before, but in high chant, not plain. How could that be? He was just a simple old glee man. Finally, in the deep hours of the night, Tom bowed with a last sweeping flourish of his cloak and headed for the stairs amid great slapping of tables. Elaine slapped.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call Into This Life for tonight. I want to thank everyone stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out